Why were their names chiseled off stone? Why were their libraries sold off by their sons? What happens when a woman builds a monument to her husband and the world calls it a wonder but forgets her name? For every powerful man remembered for the art he commissioned, is there a woman beside him or before him who actually chose the artist, paid the bill, and shaped the culture of an era, only to be written out of the story? Number 17. What if a woman ruled as a king and built for eternity? Her successor chiseled her name off temples. He smashed her statues into thousands of pieces. He tried to pretend she never existed. For 3,000 years, he almost succeeded. Her mummy, a powerful pharaoh, was lost until a single broken tooth found in a box confirmed her identity in 2007. This was Hatshepsut. She ruled Egypt not as a queen regent, a placeholder for a boy king, but as a full pharaoh. And she knew that to hold power, she had to build it. Hatshepsut came to power around 1478 BC. Her husband, Thutmose II, died. Her stepson, Thutmose III, was a child. She was supposed to rule in his name. But Hatshepsut had other plans. She was of royal blood, the daughter of Pharaoh. She decided she would not be a substitute. She would be the king. This was a radical move. Egyptian leadership was a male role. The pharaoh was the living Horus, a male god. To justify her rule, Hatshepsut needed more than an army. She needed a story. She used art and architecture as propaganda on a scale rarely seen before. Her greatest project was her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri. It is a masterpiece of ancient architecture. It rises from the desert floor in 3 massive terraces, connected by long ramps. It looks modern even today. It was designed by her chief steward, Senamut. Some historians believe they were lovers. He held over 80 titles and was given the rare honor of having his own image included in her temple. But the temple was not just a beautiful building, it was a political statement carved in stone. On its walls, Hatshepsut told the story of her divine birth. The carvings show the god Amun taking the form of her father, Thutmose II. He approaches her mother, Queen Ahmose. The text says, Amun himself declared she would rule Egypt. This was not a humble claim, it was a direct challenge to anyone who questioned her right to the throne. She was not just a regent, she was the chosen daughter of the greatest god. She was destined to rule. She also documented her achievements. One of the most famous sections shows her expedition to the land of Punt. We are not entirely sure where Punt was. Maybe modern-day Somalia or Eritrea. The carvings show Egyptian ships sailing south. They show the strange houses of the Puntites built on stilts. They show the Egyptians trading for Punt's riches. They brought back gold, ivory, and exotic animals. Most importantly, they brought back live myrrh trees. 31 of them. They were planted on the terraces of her temple. This was the first recorded attempt to transplant foreign trees. It was a scientific expedition, a trade mission, and a political triumph all in one. And she made sure everyone knew about it by carving it into the walls of her eternal home. To further cement her rule, Hatshepsut adopted the full regalia of a male pharaoh. In statues and carvings, she is shown with a male body. She wears the traditional kilt and the false beard of kingship. This was not about denying her womanhood. It was about using the established language of power. The image of the pharaoh was a male image. So, to be pharaoh, she presented herself as one. She controlled her own image completely. She also built on a grand scale at the Temple of Karnak, the most important religious center in Egypt. She erected 4 massive obelisks there. These were single pieces of red granite quarried at Aswan hundreds of miles to the south. One of them, still standing, is nearly 100 feet tall and weighs over 300 tons. Transporting and erecting these was an incredible feat of engineering. The inscriptions on their bases state they were covered in electrum, a mix of gold and silver, so they would shine across the land. But her legacy was fragile. After she died, her stepson, Thutmose III, finally took the throne. For 20 years, he did nothing. Then, late in his reign, he began a campaign to erase her. Her statues were toppled and buried. Her name was scraped from cartouches on temple walls. Her image was replaced with that of her father, her husband, or Thutmose III himself. He was rewriting history, trying to smooth over the uncomfortable fact of a long and successful female reign. It was a systematic attempt to delete a queen from memory. But he could not destroy everything. There, El-Bahri was too magnificent. The obelisks were too tall. Archaeologists were able to piece together her story from the fragments he left behind. Hatshepsut used art to claim power, and in the end it was that art that saved her from oblivion. Number 16. How do you build a wonder of the world for the man you love? She mixed her husband's ashes with water and drank them every day. She offered a fortune to any poet, artist, or philosopher who could create the most magnificent tribute to his memory. She built him a tomb so spectacular that it became one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Her name was Artemisia II of Caria. The tomb she built gave us the word mausoleum. Artemisia lived in the 4th century BC. She ruled Caria, a small kingdom in modern-day Turkey, which was part of the vast Persian Empire. She was not just the queen, she was the sister and wife of the king Mausolus. This was a common practice in her family. It kept power and wealth consolidated. When Mausolus died around 353 BC, Artemisia was left in sole command. She was by all accounts overcome with grief, but she was also a shrewd and effective ruler. Her grief became the driving force for one of the greatest artistic projects in history. She decided to build a tomb for Mausolus in their capital city, Halicarnassus. This would be no ordinary tomb. It would be a monument to their love, their power, and their dynasty. She spared no expense. She sent out calls across the Greek world, summoning the most famous artists of the age. The architects were Satyrus and Pythias of Priene, but the real stars were the sculptors. She hired 4 of them, each a master. Leochares, Bryaxis, Scopas of Paros, and Timotheus. Each was assigned one side of the massive structure to decorate. This was like assembling a dream team of Renaissance artists to work on a single cathedral. Pliny the Elder, the Roman writer, tells us they even continued to work on the project after Artemisia's death just for the sake of their own fame and the glory of their art. The mausoleum was unlike anything seen before. It was a fusion of styles. It had the high, solid base of a local Lycian tomb. It was surrounded by a colonnade of 36 Ionic Greek columns, and it was topped with a stepped pyramid roof like an Egyptian pharaoh's tomb. On the very top was a massive marble sculpture of a 4-horse chariot, a quadriga, with statues of Mausolus and Artemisia riding within it. The entire structure was about 148 feet tall, the height of a 15-story building, and every surface was covered in sculpture. There were life-sized statues of people and gods between the columns. There were giant marble lions guarding the stairs. But the most famous parts were the friezes, the carved bands of relief sculpture. They depicted epic scenes from Greek mythology, a battle between Greeks and Amazons, the chariot race of Pelops and Oenomaus, fights with centaurs. These were not just decorations. They were a statement. Mausolus and Artemisia, though Carian subjects of Persia, were presenting themselves as inheritors of Greek culture and heroism. They were rulers on a world stage. Artemisia was not just a grieving widow with a big budget. She was an active patron. She understood botany and medicine. She was a military commander. When the island of Rhodes, a nearby rival, heard that a woman was now in charge of Caria, they sent their fleet to capture Halicarnassus. They thought it would be an easy victory. Artemisia hid her own fleet in a secret harbor within the city. She let the Rhodian ships sail into the main harbor. Her citizens cheered from the city walls, making it seem like they were welcoming them. Once the Rhodian soldiers disembarked and went into the city, Artemisia's fleet sailed out of the secret harbor, captured the empty Rhodian ships, and sailed them back to Rhodes. The Rhodians, seeing their own ships returning, assumed their army had won and opened the city gates. And Artemisia's forces took the city. She was as strategic in war as she was in art. She only ruled for 2 years after her husband's death. She died in 351 BC, supposedly from her continued, all-consuming grief. The mausoleum was not yet finished, but the artists she had hired completed it, it stood for over 1,500 years. It survived Alexander the Great's conquest. It was a landmark for sailors and travelers. A series of earthquakes between the 12th and 15th centuries finally brought it down. In the 15th century, the Knights of St. John used its stones to fortify their castle at Bodrum. They burned many of the marble sculptures for lime. For centuries, the mausoleum was just a story. But in 1857, the British archaeologist Charles Thomas Newton excavated the site. He found parts of the friezes, a wheel from the chariot on the roof, and the magnificent portrait statues of Mausolus and Artemisia. These pieces are now in the British Museum in London. They are all that is left of a queen's tribute to her husband, a project so ambitious and beautiful it gave a new word to our language and became a wonder of the world. At number 15, could a queen invent a new way to love? She was Queen of France, then Queen of England. She was the mother of 2 English kings. She was imprisoned by her own husband for 16 years. But before all that, Eleanor of Aquitaine championed a radical new idea, courtly love. Her patronage of poets and musicians created a cultural revolution that shaped our modern ideas of romance. Eleanor was born around 1122 in what is now southern France. Her home, the Duchy of Aquitaine, was not like the rest of Europe. It was wealthy, sophisticated, and culturally vibrant. Her grandfather, William the Next, was one of the first known troubadours, the poet-composers, who wrote and sang about love. Eleanor grew up in a world where art and poetry were central to court life. When she was 15, she became Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right and married the future King Louis VII of France. The court in Paris was grim and pious compared to her sunny, artistic homeland. Eleanor brought the culture of the South with her. She encouraged troubadours and trouvères to come to her court. These poets wrote in the vernacular, the language of the people, not Latin. Their songs were about a new kind of love. It was not the practical, political love of arranged marriages. It was a passionate, often secret, and idealized love. The knight would devote himself to a noble lady, often a married one. He would perform great deeds in her honor. She was his inspiration, his superior. This was the birth of courtly love. Eleanor's marriage to Louis was not a success. She found him more like a monk than a king. They had 2 daughters, but no sons. After 15 years, their marriage was annulled in 1152. This was a shocking event. But what was more shocking was what Eleanor did next. Just 8 weeks later, she married Henry, Duke of Normandy, who was 11 years younger than her. 2 years later, he became King Henry II of England. Eleanor was now Queen of England. Her court at Poitiers, back in her native Aquitaine, became the center of this new culture. It was known as the Court of Love. Here, Eleanor and her daughter Marie de Champagne presided over gatherings where nobles would debate the rules of love. They would discuss questions like, can true love exist between married people? Is it better to be loved by someone who is faithful or someone who is constantly striving to win your affection? These were not just games, they were a serious exploration of human emotion, led by women. Eleanor was the patron of some of the greatest writers of the age. One was Wace, who she commissioned to translate Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain into French. His version, the Roman de Brute, was the book that introduced the story of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table to a wide courtly audience. Another was Benoit de Saint-Amour, who wrote a long romance about the Trojan War, but perhaps her most important connection was with Andreas Capellanus. He wrote a book called De Amore, or The Art of Courtly Love. It was a kind of manual for lovers, codifying the rules discussed at Eleanor's court. The book claims to be written at the request of Marie de Champagne. It laid out the principles of this new romantic code. Love was a kind of suffering. It was jealous. It could not be commanded. It was ennobling. This book was hugely influential for centuries. It shaped the work of writers like Dante and Petrarch. Eleanor's patronage was not just about literature. She supported musicians. She was a great patron of architecture. She funded the rebuilding of the Abbey Church of Fontevraud, where she would eventually be buried. She was also politically active, ruling as regent in England when Henry was away and during the reign of her son, Richard the Lionheart. Her relationship with Henry II soured. She supported her sons in a revolt against their father in 1173. The revolt failed. Henry had her arrested and kept her in confinement for 16 years. Even in prison, her influence continued through her children and the culture she had created. When Henry died in 1189, her son Richard I became king and immediately freed her. She was nearly 70 years old, but her career was far from over. She acted as regent while Richard was on the Third Crusade. When he was captured and held for ransom on his way home, it was Eleanor, then in her 70s, who traveled across Germany to negotiate his release. Eleanor of Aquitaine lived to be about 82. She outlived most of her children. She was a political force, a duchess and a queen twice over. But her most enduring legacy was cultural. She did not just commission art, she helped create the subject matter. She took the romantic ideals of her homeland and through her patronage spread them across Europe. The idea that love should be a noble, passionate pursuit, not just a contract, owes a great deal to this one remarkable queen. Number 14. What if a queen's faith built a university? She was crowned king, not queen. She was just 11 years old. She donated all her royal jewels and insignia to fund the restoration of a university. She ruled during a time of immense political turmoil, but her greatest legacy was not in battle, but in books and buildings. Her name was Jadwiga, and she was the king of Poland. So Jadwiga was born in 1374. She was the youngest daughter of Louis the Great, king of Hungary and Poland. She was not originally destined for the Polish throne. She was betrothed at the age of 4 to William of Habsburg, an Austrian duke. But when her father died, the Polish nobles rejected her older sister and her sister's husband. They wanted Jadwiga. But they had a condition. She had to break her engagement to William and marry Ladislaw II Jagiello, the Grand Duke of Lithuania. This was a purely political move. Jagiello was a pagan. The marriage would unite Poland and Lithuania, creating a massive state capable of standing up to the powerful Teutonic Knights. It would also bring Christianity to Lithuania, the last pagan state in Europe. For Jadwiga, who was a deeply devout Catholic and perhaps in love with her childhood fiancé, this was a huge personal sacrifice. She was just a child faced with a decision that would shape the future of Eastern Europe. She agreed. In 1384, at the age of 10, she arrived in Krakow and was crowned. But she was not crowned queen consort. The Polish crown was not her husband's to give. She inherited it from her father. So, she was crowned Rex Poloniae, King of Poland. The title acknowledged that she was the monarch in her own right. From the start, Jadwiga was more than a figurehead. She was an active ruler, a diplomat, and a patron. She spoke multiple languages, including Polish, Hungarian, Latin, German, and Italian. She was well-educated and surrounded herself with scholars and artists. She sponsored the translation of religious texts into Polish, making them accessible to more people. Her greatest act of patronage concerned the University of Krakow. The university had been founded by Casimir the Great in 1364, but had fallen into decline after his death. Jadwiga understood the importance of a national center of learning. She wanted to revive it, and specifically, to add a theology department, which it lacked. This required permission from the Pope. Jadwiga spent years petitioning the papacy. In 1397, Pope Boniface IX finally gave his consent. But a papal bull was not enough. The university needed money. It needed buildings and professors. Jadwiga took a radical step. In her last will and testament, she bequeathed her entire personal fortune to the university. This included all her jewelry, her royal regalia, even the money from the sale of her royal gowns. It was an act of incredible generosity and foresight. It was her personal wealth, not state funds, that re-established the university. She did not live to see her vision fully realized. Jadwiga died in 1399 at the age of 25, shortly after giving birth to her first child, who also died. Her husband, Jagiello, carried out her wishes. Using the funds from her will, he purchased buildings and formally refounded the university in 1400. In her honor, it was renamed the Jagiellonian University. The Jagiellonian University became one of the great universities of Europe. For centuries, it was a major center for mathematics, astronomy, and humanities. One of its most famous students was Nicolaus Copernicus, the astronomer who proposed that the Earth revolved around the sun. His revolutionary scientific ideas were nurtured at the institution that Jadwiga's personal sacrifice had made possible. Jadwiga's patronage extended beyond the university. She funded hospitals and churches. She commissioned beautiful religious art and illuminated manuscripts. She was a skilled diplomat, personally leading negotiations with the Teutonic Knights. She was known for her charity and her piety. After her death, she was immediately regarded as a saint by the Polish people. The Catholic Church officially canonized her in 1997. Jadwiga of Poland ruled for only 15 years. Her life was short and marked by personal sacrifice. She was a child bride in a political marriage, but she used her position as king to foster a cultural and intellectual flowering. By giving away her jewels, she created something far more valuable, a center of learning that would shape her nation's identity for over 600 years. Number 13, could a woman's taste define a renaissance? She wrote over 12,000 letters micromanaging artists and haggling over prices. She created a private study, a studiolo, that became one of the most famous art collections of its time. She pursued a painting from Leonardo da Vinci for years, but he never delivered. She was Isabella d'Este, the Marchesa of Mantua. She was not just a collector, she was a director, a curator, and the driving force behind the art of her time. They called her La Prima Donna del Mondo, the First Lady of the World. Isabella was born in 1474 in Ferrara, a city with a brilliant court. Her father was the Duke of Ferrara. She received an exceptional humanist education. She studied Latin and Greek, learned to dance, play music, and debate philosophy. From a young age, she understood that art was not just decoration, it was a projection of power, intelligence, and status. At 16, she married Francesco II Gonzaga, the Marquis of Mantua. Mantua was a smaller, less culturally significant city than Ferrara. Isabella set out to change that. She began a lifelong project of turning Mantua into a major center of the Renaissance. She did this through relentless strategic patronage. Her most famous project was her studiolo. This was a small room in the ducal palace, her private retreat. She decided to decorate it with a series of allegorical paintings based on classical mythology. But she did not just give the artists a general theme. Her court humanists devised incredibly detailed written programs for each painting. These instructions, called invenzioni, spelled out exactly what should be depicted. The size of the figures, their poses, their clothing, the landscape, the symbolic meaning of every element. She sent these instructions to the most famous painters in Italy. She commissioned Andrea Mantegna, the court painter in Mantua, to create 2 masterpieces for the room, Pallas expelling the vices from the Garden of Virtue and Mars and Venus. And she also commissioned works from Perugino, Lorenzo Costa, and Correggio. She tried for years to get paintings from Giovanni Bellini and Leonardo da Vinci. So Bellini resisted her strict instructions, wanting more artistic freedom. Leonardo, always busy with other projects, promised a painting but never finished one. Her letters to them show her determination. She cajoles, she flatters, she threatens. She was a demanding patron who knew exactly what she wanted. Beyond the paintings, her studiolo and an adjoining grotto were filled with her collections. She collected antique Roman sculptures, rare coins, gems, and musical instruments. It was a museum of classical and contemporary art, curated to reflect her learning and taste. It became a famous tourist attraction. Important visitors to Mantua were given a tour by Isabella herself. Isabella was also a major patron of fashion. Her style was copied by women across Italy and France. She invented new styles of hats and necklines. She had agents in Venice and Milan who sent her samples of the latest fabrics. She even had dolls dressed in her latest creations sent to the Queen of France. Music was another of her passions. She played the lute and clavichord. She employed famous composers like Bartolomeo Tromboncino and Marchetto Cara at her court. They composed frattle, a popular form of song, often setting poems by Petrarch to music. Her court became a leading center for musical innovation. She was also a shrewd political operator. When her husband was captured by the Venetians, Isabella ruled Mantua as regent. She successfully navigated a complex political situation, negotiating with the Pope, the Holy Roman Emperor, and the King of France. She proved to be a more capable ruler than her husband. Isabella's collecting was an obsession. She used her political connections to acquire art. After the fall of the Sforza family in Milan, she tried to get her hands on Leonardo's notebooks. When another family, the Montefeltro of Urbino, were exiled, she acquired their prized antique statue of Cupid by Michelangelo. This was seen by some as ruthless, taking advantage of another's misfortune. But for Isabella, building her collection was paramount. Her legacy is immense. The collection she assembled was one of the finest of the Renaissance. While it was eventually sold off by her descendants, her letters provide an unparalleled record of a Renaissance patron at work. We see her taste, her ambition, and her business-like approach to art. She treated paintings like investments in diplomatic assets. Isabella d'Este showed that a woman, through sheer force of will and a brilliant eye, could shape the cultural landscape of her time. She did not just buy art. She willed it into existence. Number 12. Can you rule an empire through art? She collected over 300 paintings, including works by Jan van Eyck and Rogier van der Weyden. Her library contained over 200 precious manuscripts. She was the patron of the greatest composer of the age, Josquin des Prez. But she was not a queen of a major power. She was Margaret of Austria, the regent of the Netherlands, and from her court in Mechelen, she created a cultural hub that rivaled any in Europe. Margaret's life was a series of political chess moves made by her powerful Habsburg family. She was born in 1480. Her father was Maximilian I, the Holy Roman Emperor. At the age of 3, she was sent to France to marry the Dauphin, Charles Vide. She was raised at the French court, prepared to be Queen of France, but when she was 11, Charles repudiated their treaty and married Anne of Brittany instead. The young Margaret was sent back to her family in disgrace. Her next marriage was to John, Prince of Asturias, the heir to the thrones of Castile and Aragon in Spain. She sailed to Spain in 1497. The marriage was reportedly a happy one, but it lasted only 6 months. John died of a fever. Margaret, pregnant at the time, later gave birth to a stillborn daughter. A widow at 17, she returned from Spain. Her third marriage was to Philibert II, Duke of Savoy. This too was a happy union, but it also ended in tragedy. Philibert died after just 3 years. Margaret, now 24, was a widow for the third time. She refused to marry again. She wore widow's clothing for the rest of her life. In 1507, her father Maximilian appointed her regent of the Habsburg Netherlands for her young nephew, the future Emperor Charles V. She would rule the Netherlands for most of the next 23 years. She was a brilliant politician and diplomat. She negotiated the League of Cambrai, an alliance against Venice. She also negotiated the Ladies' Peace of 1529, ending a war between her nephew and the King of France. But her great passion was art. At her palace in Mechelen, she assembled one of the most important collections in Northern Europe. She was not just a passive inheritor of art. She was an active, knowledgeable collector. She had a special love for portraits. She owned the famous Arnolfini portrait by Jan van Eyck, which she inherited. She commissioned portraits of herself, her family, and her court from her court painter Bernard van Orly. Her collection was housed in a special library and gallery she had built at her palace. An inventory taken in 1524 lists a stunning array of treasures. Paintings, tapestries, sculptures, illuminated manuscripts, scientific instruments, and objects from the New World like Aztec featherwork. She was one of the first European collectors to appreciate these non-European artifacts as works of art. She was also a major patron of music. Her court chapel choir was one of the finest in Europe. She supported composers like Pierre Delarue and Josquin des Prez, a giant of Renaissance music. She wrote poetry herself, much of it expressing her grief over her lost husbands. Margaret was not just collecting for her own pleasure. Her art collection was a tool of statecraft. Her portrait gallery was a visual representation of her family's power and vast territorial claims. The Habsburg dynasty was built on strategic marriages. The portraits reminded everyone of these dynastic connections. When she hosted foreign ambassadors, a tour of her collection was part of the diplomatic ritual. It was designed to impress and intimidate. She was also responsible for the education of her nephew Charles and his sisters. She ensured they received a top-tier humanist education steeped in art and music. She was shaping the tastes of the next generation of European rulers. When the German artist Albrecht Dürer visited the Netherlands in 1521, he went to Mechelen to see Margaret and her famous collection. He described her palace as the most beautiful in the land. Margaret of Austria was a widow who turned personal tragedy into a source of strength. She channeled her energies into politics and art. She never remarried, choosing instead to rule. At Mechelen, she created a court that was a center of power, diplomacy, and culture. Her collection was a reflection of her personal history, her political ambitions, and her exquisite taste. It was a model for the great royal collections that would be built across Europe in the centuries to follow. Number 11. Can a book of prayers be a masterpiece? It contains 677 pages of a calfskin parchment called vellum. It is decorated with 132 miniature paintings, so detailed they look like tiny panel paintings. Each page is bordered with an incredible variety of over 300 plants and insects, all painted from life. This is the Grand Histoire de Bretagne, one of the most magnificent illuminated manuscripts ever created. It was commissioned by Anne of Brittany, a queen who used her patronage to assert her own identity and the identity of her independent duchy. Anne was born in 1477. She was the daughter of the Duke of Brittany, a region in western France that fiercely guarded its independence from the French crown. When her father died, Anne became Duchess of Brittany at the age of 11. She was now the ruler of a strategic territory and one of the wealthiest heiresses in Europe. The King of France wanted to control Brittany. The best way to do that was to marry Anne. Her life became a series of forced marriages. First, she was married by proxy to Maximilian I, the Holy Roman Emperor, the father of Margaret of Austria. But the French king, Charles V, invaded Brittany and forced her to renounce that marriage. In 1491, at the age of 14, she was forced to marry Charles. She was now Queen of France, but she made sure the marriage contract stated that if Charles died without a son, Brittany would revert to her, not the French crown. Charles died 7 years later. They had no surviving children. Anne, now a 21-year-old widow, was once again the independent Duchess of Brittany. But the new French king, Louis XII, also wanted to control her duchy. He had his own marriage annulled, and just months after Charles's death, he married Anne. She was Queen of France for a second time. In this marriage contract, she was even more assertive. She insisted that their second son or daughter would inherit Brittany, ensuring it would remain separate from France. Throughout these political struggles, Anne used art and patronage to express her status and her Breton identity. She ran her own household separate from the king's. Her court was a center of artistic activity. She commissioned tapestries, jewelry, and manuscripts. Her greatest commission was the Grands Heures, or Great Hours. A book of hours is a private prayer book. Wealthy patrons often commissioned lavishly decorated ones, but Anne's was on another level. She hired the greatest manuscript illuminator of the age, Jean Bourdichon, as her official court painter. He worked on the book for 5 years, from about 1503 to 1508. The book is a masterpiece of art and science. The large miniatures depicting scenes from the life of Christ and the saints are a mix of French and Italian Renaissance styles. But the borders are the most revolutionary part. Most manuscripts at the time used stylized decorative borders. Bourdichon, at Anne's direction, filled the margins with incredibly realistic depictions of flora and fauna. There are hundreds of different plants: strawberries, pansies, columbines, dandelions. Each one is identifiable. There are also insects, butterflies, dragonflies, snails, caterpillars. They are painted with scientific precision, including their shadows, making them look like real specimens laid on the page. This was a new approach, combining religious devotion with an intense interest in the natural world. It was a kind of botanical encyclopedia wrapped around a prayer book. The plants chosen were not random. Many were plants found in her native Brittany. The book was a personal statement, connecting her faith to her homeland. And Anne was also a patron of music. She supported composers like Antoine de Fevin, and she was a great patron of literature. She had a massive library. She commissioned the writer Jean Moreau, father of the more famous poet Clement Moreau, to write an official account of her voyage from Brittany to France for her first marriage. Anne of Brittany had a difficult life, constantly used as a political pawn. She died in 1514 at the age of 36. Her heart was placed in a golden reliquary and sent back to be buried with her parents in Brittany, a final act of devotion to her duchy. Her daughter Claude married the next king of France, and Brittany was finally formally united with France. But Anne's legacy remains in the art she commissioned. The Grandes Œuvres, now in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris, is a testament to her taste, her piety, and her intelligence. It is a very personal object. On one page, Bordechon painted a portrait of Anne herself at prayer. In a world dominated by male rulers who used her for their own political ends, her Book of Hours was a space she controlled completely. It was her masterpiece. Number 10. Can you import a Renaissance? She was called the Serpent Queen and Madame la Serpente. She was blamed for starting the French Wars of Religion. She brought the artichoke and the fork to France. She was Catherine de' Medici, and she used her immense wealth and refined Italian taste to create a cultural legacy that transformed France. Catherine was born in Florence in 1519. She was a Medici, a member of the powerful banking family that had ruled Florence and produced popes. She was orphaned as an infant and raised in convents. Her life was in constant danger. At 14, she was sent to France to marry Henry, the second son of the French king. It was a brilliant match for the Medici, but many in the French court looked down on her as the daughter of merchants. For the first 10 years of her marriage, she produced no children. She was in constant fear of being repudiated. Her husband openly preferred his mistress Diane de Poitiers. Catherine was isolated and politically powerless, but she was watching, she was learning, and she was remembering the art and culture of her native Florence, the heart of the Renaissance. After a decade, she finally began having children. She had 10 in total, including 3 who would become kings of France. When her husband became King Henry II in 1547, her position was more secure, but she was still overshadowed by his mistress. Then, in 1559, Henry II was killed in a jousting accident. Catherine's 15-year-old son became king. Suddenly, at the age of 40, Catherine de' Medici was the most powerful person in France. She would be the center of French politics for the next 30 years, ruling as regent for her young sons. Now she had the power and the money to be a patron on a grand scale, and she set about making the French court the most magnificent in Europe. She brought her Italian tastes with her. One of her main interests was architecture. She had a passion for building. She commissioned the architect Philibert Delorme to build her a new palace in Paris, the Tuileries Palace. She also added a new wing to the Louvre. She spent fortunes on chateaux, like the magnificent Chateau de Chenonceau, which she took from her old rival Diane de Poitiers. Her building projects were designed to project the power and stability of the Valois dynasty, which was threatened by religious civil war. But Catherine is perhaps most famous for her patronage of festivals and spectacles. These were not just parties. They were elaborate, expensive theatrical productions with a political purpose. They were called magnifices. They involved music, dance, poetry, and elaborate floats and stage machinery. They were often held to celebrate royal weddings or to impress foreign dignitaries. One of the most famous was the festival at Bayonne in 1565. It was part of a 2-year tour of France that Catherine organized to show the young King Charles IX to his people and to promote peace between Catholics and Protestants. The festival included a mock tournament on the water with boats disguised as a whale and a sea turtle. These spectacles also gave birth to a new art form, the ballet de cour, or court ballet. These were not like modern ballet. They were a mix of dance, song, and verse, all organized around a mythological theme. The most famous was the Ballet Comique de la Reine, staged in 1581 for a royal wedding. It lasted for over 5 hours and cost a staggering 3.6 million francs. It is considered by many to be the first true ballet. It was a massive piece of political propaganda telling a story about the triumph of reason and order, a clear message in a country torn apart by war. Catherine was also a collector. She amassed a huge collection of art, books, and curiosities. She was interested in portraiture. She hired the painter Francois Clouet to document the royal family. His simple, direct portraits are an incredible record of the French court. Catherine de' Medici has a dark reputation. She is forever linked to the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572 when thousands of Protestants were killed in Paris. Her role in it is still debated by historians, but her cultural legacy is undeniable. She brought the Italian Renaissance to France in a way no one had before. She understood that art and spectacle were not frivolous, they were tools of power. They could create a sense of national unity and project an image of royal splendor, even in the darkest of times. She spent a lifetime building, and what she built helped to define French culture for centuries. Number 9. Did a queen use her portrait as a weapon? She never married. She was called the Virgin Queen. Her image is one of the most recognizable in history: a pale face, a red wig, a massive ruff, and a dress covered in jewels and symbols. This was not just fashion. It was a carefully constructed political brand. Elizabeth I of England was a master of propaganda, and her primary medium was her own portrait. When Elizabeth came to the throne in 1558, she was 25 years old. She inherited a country that was religiously divided and financially weak. As an unmarried woman, her position was precarious. Many believed a woman could not rule alone. Her council, her parliament, and foreign rulers all pressured her to marry. A husband would provide stability and an heir, but Elizabeth refused. Marriage would mean sharing power or even ceding it to a husband, especially a foreign one. She decided to rule alone. To do this, she needed to create a new kind of authority. She needed to project an image of strength, wisdom, and eternal youth. She used portraiture to do it. In the early years of her reign, her portraits are relatively realistic. They show a young woman with reddish gold hair. But as she got older, the portraits became less about likeness and more about symbolism. They became icons. After a bout of smallpox in 1562 that scarred her face, Elizabeth began to control her image more tightly. She wore thick, white makeup made of lead and vinegar to create a smooth, pale mask. Unofficial portraits were banned. A face pattern was created by her court artist Nicholas Hilliard, which all other painters were supposed to copy. This pattern showed her as ageless, a timeless beauty. This was the mask of youth. Her portraits are filled with symbols that an educated Elizabethan would have understood. A pelican pecking its own breast to feed its young was a symbol of self-sacrifice and her role as mother to her people. An ermine, a small weasel-like animal, symbolized purity and royalty. A sieve represented her wisdom and virginity. A serpent on her sleeve stood for cunning. Pearls all over her dress were symbols of her virginity. The moon was a symbol of the virgin goddess Cynthia, a nickname for Elizabeth. The sun represented her power as a monarch. Her dresses themselves were works of art and political statements. They were incredibly elaborate and expensive, designed to display her immense wealth and status. They were often embroidered with images of English plants and animals, a subtle assertion of her connection to her kingdom. 3 portraits from late in her reign show the culmination of this strategy. The Ditchley portrait shows her standing on a map of England, a colossus bestriding her kingdom. Storms are behind her, but the sun shines where she stands. She is the source of England's peace and prosperity. The Armada portrait, painted to commemorate the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, is her most famous. She is shown in a magnificent dress, her hand resting on a globe, her fingers pointing to the Americas, a sign of England's imperial ambitions. In the background, we see the English fleet in calm seas and the Spanish fleet being wrecked in a storm. The message is clear: Elizabeth is a divinely protected, powerful ruler who has saved her nation. The rainbow portrait painted near the end of her life when she was in her late 60s, shows her as a young woman. She holds a rainbow, a symbol of peace. Her cloak is decorated with eyes and ears, showing that she sees and hears all. The inscription reads, Non sine sol iris. No rainbow without the sun. She is the sun that brings peace to the land. Beyond painting, the Elizabethan era was a golden age of English literature. While the Queen was not a direct patron of the public theaters where Shakespeare's plays were performed, her stable and vibrant court created the conditions for a cultural flowering. She loved plays and had them performed at court. She supported writers like Edmund Spenser, whose epic poem, The Faerie Queen, is a massive allegory praising Elizabeth. She was also a talented writer and translator herself. Elizabeth, I understood the power of image in a way few rulers have. She could not lead her armies into battle like a king, so she created a cult of personality around herself. She used portraits, fashion, and literature to project an image of a semi-divine monarch, eternally young, wise, and powerful. She was married to her kingdom. Her artists and writers were her public relations team, and the brand they created helped her rule successfully for over 40 years. Number 8. How do you build a monument to the love of your life? It is often called the Babi Taj. It is a jewel box of a tomb made of white marble and decorated with intricate inlays of semi-precious stones. It is considered a forerunner to the Taj Mahal, but it was not built by a king for his wife. It was designed and commissioned by an empress for her father. Her name was Nur Jahan, and she was the most powerful woman in the history of the Mughal Empire. Nur Jahan was born Mir-un-Nisa in 1577. Her family was from Persia. She was married at 17 to a Persian soldier, but in 1607 her husband was killed. A widow with a young daughter, she was brought to the imperial court to be a lady-in-waiting. The Emperor Jahangir saw her and was captivated by her beauty and intelligence. In 1611, they were married. He gave her the name Nur Jahan, meaning light of the world. This was no ordinary royal marriage. Jahangir was deeply in love with Nur Jahan, but he was also an addict, dependent on wine and opium. He was happy to let his brilliant wife take over the affairs of state. For the next 16 years, Nur Jahan was the effective ruler of the Mughal Empire, one of the wealthiest and most powerful empires in the world. She was the only Mughal empress to have coins struck in her own name. She sat in on royal audiences, issuing orders. She controlled appointments to high office. She even led troops. She was a brilliant administrator and a shrewd politician. And she was one of the greatest patrons of art and architecture of her time. Nur Jahan had a refined aesthetic sense influenced by her Persian heritage. She set the style for the court. She designed new fabrics and dresses. She is credited with popularizing the use of attar of roses, a perfume. But her most lasting contributions were in architecture. Her masterpiece is the tomb she built for her father, Artemisia in Agra. He died in 1622. Nur Jahan immediately began work on his mausoleum. It was completed in 1628. It marks a major transition in Mughal architecture. Earlier Mughal buildings, like Humayun's tomb, were primarily made of red sandstone. The tomb of Artemisia was the first Mughal structure to be built almost entirely of white marble. But its most stunning feature is the decoration. The entire surface is covered in pietra dura, an intricate inlay technique using semi-precious stones. Carnelian, jasper, lapis lazuli, onyx, and topaz are carved into delicate floral and geometric patterns and set into the marble. It is breathtakingly beautiful. The designs are a mix of Persian and Indian motifs. Cypresses, wine vessels, and fruit bowls show the Persian influence. The overall effect is of a precious casket. The tomb is set in a classic Persian-style sherbag garden, divided into 4 quadrants by water channels. The whole complex is perfectly symmetrical and harmonious. It is a deeply personal monument built by a powerful daughter to honor her father. It also served as a blueprint. Her stepson, Shah Jahan, would use many of its elements, the white marble, the pietra dura, the garden setting down on a much larger scale when he built the Taj Mahal for his own wife a few years later. Nur Jahan's patronage was not limited to this one building. She designed and laid out several important gardens in Kashmir and Agra. These gardens, with their flowing water and fragrant flowers, were seen as earthly paradises. She also built caravanserais, roadside inns for travelers and merchants along the major trade routes of the empire. When her husband Jahangir died in 1627, Nur Jahan's power came to an abrupt end. Her stepson Shah Jahan took the throne. He viewed her as a rival and placed her under house arrest. She spent the last 18 years of her life in confinement in Lahore, living on a generous pension. During this time, she oversaw the construction of her own tomb, a more modest structure of red sandstone near that of her husband. Nur Jahan was a remarkable figure. She rose from being the daughter of a minor noble to become the de facto ruler of a vast empire. She was a brilliant politician, a military strategist, and a tastemaker who left a permanent mark on Mughal art and architecture. The delicate, beautiful tomb she built for her father is a fitting memorial to a woman of immense power and refined taste. Number 7. Why would a queen give up her throne for books? She invited the philosopher René Descartes to her court to teach her. He had to be there at 5 a.m. in the middle of a Swedish winter. He caught pneumonia and died. She assembled one of the greatest art collections in Europe, much of it looted during the 30 Years' War. Then, at the age of 28, at the height of her power, she abdicated her throne, converted to Catholicism, and moved to Rome to become a patron of the arts. She was Christina, Queen of Sweden. Christina was born in 1626. She was the only surviving child of King Gustavus Adolphus, the great Protestant hero of the 30 Years' War. He was killed in battle when she was 6 years old. From that moment, she was the Queen of Sweden. Her father had ordered that she be given the education of a prince, not a princess. She studied classics, philosophy, theology, and science. She learned at least 8 languages. She was brilliant, but she hated the traditional duties of a queen. She had no interest in marriage or producing an heir. She called marriage a bondage. Her real passion was learning. She wanted to make Stockholm the Athens of the North. She began to spend lavishly, using the state treasury to attract scholars and artists from all over Europe. She invited prominent intellectuals like Hugo Grotius and Claude Saumaise. Her most famous invitation was to René Descartes in 1649. Christina was fascinated by his philosophy. Their early morning tutoring sessions in the drafty royal library were a disaster for the philosopher's health. His death in Stockholm in 1650 was a scandal. At the same time, Christina was building a spectacular art collection. The end of the 30 Years' War in 1648 gave her a great opportunity. As part of the peace settlement, Swedish armies had looted the magnificent art collection of Emperor Rudolf II from Prague Castle. Hundreds of masterpieces by artists like Titian, Veronese, Correggio, and Dürer were packed up and shipped to Stockholm. Christina added to this collection with her own purchases. She also built a massive library, sending agents across Europe to buy up entire collections of books and manuscripts. But Christina was growing restless. She was tired of ruling. She found Swedish culture provincial, and she was secretly drawn to Catholicism, the religion of her country's enemies. The Lutheran orthodoxy of Sweden felt stifling to her intellectual curiosity. In 1654, she did the unthinkable. She abdicated her throne in favor of her cousin. It was a spectacular public ceremony. She had her royal regalia removed from her, one piece at a time. She then left Sweden, traveling across Europe in disguise, dressed as a man. In Brussels, she secretly converted to Catholicism. She then made her way to Rome, where she was welcomed by the Pope as a major prize for the Catholic Church. She would live in Rome for the next 30 years. In Rome, Christina became one of the city's most important cultural figures. She established a salon in her palace that was the center of Roman intellectual life. She founded the Academy of Arcadia, a gathering of poets and writers who wanted to reform Italian literature. She was a major patron of music. She supported composers like Arcangelo Corelli and Alessandro Scarlatti. She opened the city's first public opera house. She was also a patron of science. She had a laboratory in her palace and supported scientific research. She was a staunch defender of intellectual freedom. When King Louis XIV of France revoked the Edict of Nantes, which had protected French Protestants, Christina, now a fervent Catholic, wrote him a letter condemning his intolerance. Christina was a complex and contradictory figure. She was brilliant and impulsive, generous and ruthless. She abandoned her country and her religion, but she never abandoned her passion for art and learning. She turned her back on political power to pursue a life of the mind. Her collection was eventually sold and scattered, but her influence on the cultural life of Rome was profound. She was a queen without a kingdom, but she ruled over a court of artists, musicians, and thinkers, the only court she ever truly wanted. Number 6. Was she the mother of her country or just its bookkeeper? She fought wars, reformed the army, and overhauled the tax system. She had 16 children, including a future Holy Roman Emperor and the future Queen of France, Marie Antoinette. She ruled a vast and diverse empire for 40 years, but Maria Theresa of Austria also found time to transform her capital, Vienna, into a cultural center and to support a 6-year-old musical prodigy named Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Maria Theresa was never supposed to rule. She was born in 1717. Her father, Emperor Charles VI, had no male heirs. He spent most of his reign persuading the other European powers to accept a decree called the Pragmatic Sanction, which would allow his daughter to inherit the Habsburg lands. When he died in 1740, many of the rulers who had agreed to it immediately went back on their word. Frederick the Great of Prussia invaded the rich province of Silesia. France, Spain, and Bavaria joined in. The War of the Austrian Succession began. The 23-year-old Maria Theresa, a young woman with no training in statecraft, had to fight for her inheritance. She rallied her troops, made a famous emotional appeal to the Hungarian nobility, and managed to save her empire, though she lost Silesia. This experience shaped her entire reign. She was a pragmatist and a reformer. She realized the Habsburg monarchy needed to be modernized if it was to survive. She centralized the government, improved the training of the army, and created a more efficient system of taxation. She was deeply conservative and a devout Catholic, but her reforms laid the groundwork for a more modern state. Her patronage was also practical and aimed at enhancing the prestige of her dynasty. Her most visible project was the transformation of Schönbrunn Palace, a summer residence outside Vienna. She turned it into the magnificent Baroque palace we see today. It was meant to rival the Palace of Versailles in France. It had 1,441 rooms, a theater, a chapel, and vast formal gardens. Schönbrunn became the center of court life and a symbol of Habsburg power. Inside the palace, Maria Theresa's personal tastes were more for the intimate Rococo style. She had rooms decorated with exquisite wood paneling, mirrors, and delicate furniture. The famous Millions Room is paneled with rare rosewood and decorated with 260 Indian and Persian miniatures. She was also a great patron of music. Vienna was already a musical city, but under her reign, it became the musical capital of Europe. She supported the court opera, but her most famous musical encounter came in 1762. Leopold Mozart brought his 2 child prodigies, the 6-year-old Wolfgang and his sister Nannerl, to perform for the imperial family at Schönbrunn. The young Wolfgang charmed the empress. He is said to have jumped into her lap and given her a kiss. The performance was a huge success and helped launch Mozart's international career. Maria Theresa's reforms also extended to education and science. She reformed the University of Vienna. She established new military academies and schools of surgery. She was interested in botany and natural history. She established the botanical gardens at Schönbrunn and supported scientific expeditions. But her rule was not without its darker side. She was intolerant of Protestants and Jews. While she was a ruler of the Enlightenment in her administrative reforms, she was not in her social and religious policies. Maria Theresa was a force of nature. She was a devoted wife to her husband, Emperor Francis I, and a famously attentive mother, at least by royal standards. She wore mourning clothes for the rest of her life after her husband's death. She was also a shrewd and tough ruler who guided her empire through decades of war and change. She was not a connoisseur of art in the way Isabella d'Este was. Her patronage was always linked to the needs of the state and the glory of her family. But in building Schönbrunn and fostering the musical culture of Vienna, she created a legacy that was both majestic and enduring. Number 5. Could a German princess conquer the world with art? She corresponded with Voltaire and Diderot, the leading thinkers of the Enlightenment. She bought an entire library from Diderot just to save him from poverty, then paid him a salary to be her librarian. She amassed a collection of over 4,000 paintings, 10,000 drawings, and 32,000 engraved gems. This collection became the basis for one of the greatest museums in the world, the Hermitage. She was Catherine the Great, Empress of Russia. She was not born to be empress, she was not even Russian. She was born Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst in 1729, a minor German princess. At 15, she was chosen to marry the heir to the Russian throne, the future Peter III. She moved to Russia, converted to the Orthodox faith, and took the name Catherine. Her marriage was a disaster. Her husband was immature and cruel. Catherine spent her time reading. She devoured the works of the French Enlightenment philosophers. She was preparing herself to rule. In 1762, her husband became emperor. He was deeply unpopular. After just 6 months, Catherine, with the help of the military, staged a coup. Peter was forced to abdicate and was killed shortly after. Catherine, the German princess, was now the absolute ruler of Russia. Like Elizabeth I, she knew she had a weak claim to the throne. She needed to prove her legitimacy. She did this through military expansion, legal reform, and an unprecedented campaign of cultural patronage. She wanted to show the world and her own people that Russia was not a backward semi-Asiatic nation, but a major European power at the forefront of civilization. Art was her weapon. Her biggest project was her art collection. In 1764, she bought a collection of 225 paintings from a Berlin merchant. This is considered the founding date of the Hermitage Museum. It was the beginning of a lifelong obsession. She used a network of ambassadors and agents across Europe to buy art. She bought entire collections from the estates of bankrupt aristocrats. She commissioned works from the leading artists of the day. She bought the collection of the French banker Pierre Crozet, which included works by Raphael, Rubens, and Rembrandt. She bought the collection of the British Prime Minister Robert Walpole, which brought a huge number of old master paintings to Russia. The British Parliament had refused to buy the collection for the nation. Catherine seized the opportunity. She once wrote, "It is not for the love of art that I do this, but for the glory of my country." This was a bit disingenuous. She clearly developed a deep appreciation for art, but its primary purpose was political. Her collection was a statement of Russia's wealth and sophistication. To house this ever-growing collection, she built an extension to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. She called it her Hermitage, a place of retreat. It was her private gallery where she would entertain small groups of friends and important visitors. Catherine also corresponded with the giants of the French Enlightenment. Her long friendship with Voltaire is famous. They wrote to each other for 15 years, though they never met. He was her greatest publicist in the West, praising her as a wise and enlightened monarch. Her relationship with Denis Diderot, the editor of the Great Encyclopedia, was even more remarkable. When he was in financial trouble, she bought his entire library for a huge sum, but allowed him to keep the books in Paris. She then paid him an annual salary to act as her librarian for the rest of his life. She even invited him to St. Petersburg, where they had long conversations about law and philosophy. Her patronage extended to science and education. She founded the Smolny Institute for Noble Maidens, the first state-funded institution of higher education for women in Europe. She founded the Russian Academy to oversee the study of the Russian language. She supported the Academy of Sciences. She was a champion of inoculation against smallpox, a dangerous procedure at the time. To set an example, she had herself and her son publicly inoculated. Catherine the Great was a ruler of contradictions. She was the enlightened despot who corresponded with philosophers about liberty while tightening the grip of serfdom on millions of Russian peasants. She was a brilliant propagandist who used art to project an image of a modern, civilized Russia. The image was not always the reality. But the cultural institutions she built and the magnificent art collection she assembled were very real. She transformed Russia's cultural landscape and left behind a legacy in the Hermitage that continues to enrich the world. Number 4, did a queen's love of plants change science? She met an 8-year-old Mozart and sang with him while he played the organ. She helped establish one of the world's most important botanical gardens at Kew. She was an amateur botanist with a deep scientific curiosity, yet she is often remembered only as the long-suffering wife of Mad King George. She was Queen Charlotte of the United Kingdom. Charlotte was born in 1744 in a small German duchy. In 1761, at the age of 17, she was chosen to be the bride of the newly crowned King George III. She traveled to England, met the king for the first time, and was married that same day. Their marriage was a political arrangement, but it grew into a genuinely affectionate and happy partnership. They had 15 children together. While her husband was obsessed with politics, agriculture, and astronomy, Charlotte carved out her own sphere of influence in music and science, particularly botany. She was an accomplished musician. She played the harpsichord. In 1764, the Mozart family came to London. The 8-year-old Wolfgang was a sensation. He and his family were invited to court several times. Charlotte was a warm and encouraging patron. Mozart dedicated his Opus 3 sonatas to her. One of her music teachers was Johann Christian Bach, the youngest son of the great Johann Sebastian Bach. Her support helped make London a major center for music, but her greatest passion was botany. When she married George III, he gave her Kew House on the grounds of what is now the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew. The gardens had been started by the king's mother, but it was under George and Charlotte that they were transformed into a world-class scientific institution. Charlotte took a keen personal interest in the gardens. She worked with the botanist William Ayton and the great naturalist Sir Joseph Banks, who had traveled the world with Captain Cook. The Banks helped organize a network of plant collectors who were sent all over the globe. They brought back thousands of new species to Kew. The gardens became a living library of the world's plants. Charlotte was not just a passive observer. She was a student of botany. She helped to arrange and catalog the plants. She oversaw the decoration of a cottage on the grounds with hundreds of engravings of plants from Kew. She understood the scientific importance of the work being done. Kew was not just a pretty garden, it was a center for research, studying which plants could be useful for medicine, food, or industry. For example, they worked on transplanting breadfruit from Tahiti to the Caribbean as a cheap food source for slaves, the project that led to the famous mutiny on the Bounty. The Queen's interest in botany was reflected in the decorative arts she patronized. In 1788, the ceramics manufacturer Josiah Wedgwood produced a magnificent dinner service for the Queen. It was decorated with intricate, hand-painted botanical illustrations. It became known as the Queen's Ware. Charlotte was also a great supporter of female education. She made sure her 6 daughters received a much more rigorous academic education than was typical for royal women at the time. Her later life was dominated by her husband's recurring bouts of mental illness. It was a source of great personal distress. She remained a devoted wife, caring for him through his periods of decline. This tragic part of her life has often overshadowed her own accomplishments. But Queen Charlotte was more than just a loyal spouse. She was an intelligent and curious woman who used her position to foster the arts and sciences. Her support for Mozart and Bach helped shape the musical life of her time. Her deep and knowledgeable engagement with botany helped turn Kew Gardens from a royal pleasure ground into the global scientific powerhouse it is today. She named a South African flower, the bird of paradise, Strelitzia reginae, in her own honor. It is a fitting tribute to a queen who found her own paradise in the world of plants. Number 3. Could a love of roses shape an empire? She bought a crumbling chateau and turned it into a paradise of gardens and art. She collected exotic animals, including kangaroos, emus, and a zebra. She made the rose her favorite flower, the height of fashion. She was Josephine de Beauharnais, the first Empress of France, and her patronage at the Château de Malmaison defined the style of an era. Josephine was born Marie Josephine Rose Tascher de la Pagerie in 1763 on the French island of Martinique in the Caribbean. She came to France for an arranged marriage to a young aristocrat. The marriage was unhappy, but it gave her 2 children and an entry into high society. During the French Revolution, her husband was executed, she herself was imprisoned, and narrowly avoided the guillotine. A beautiful and charming widow, she became a leading figure in the high society of post-revolutionary Paris. It was there, in 1795, that she met a young, ambitious general named Napoleon Bonaparte. He fell passionately in love with her. They married in 1796. When he staged a coup and became the leader of France, Josephine became the first lady. In 1804, when he crowned himself emperor, she became empress. In 1799, Josephine bought a small estate outside Paris called the Château de Malmaison. It would become her life's project. Napoleon was often away on military campaigns. Josephine poured her energy and a vast amount of money into transforming Malmaison. She worked with the architects Charles Percier and Pierre Fontaine to remodel the chateau in the new fashionable neoclassical style, which became known as the Empire style. It was inspired by the art of ancient Greece and Rome, reflecting Napoleon's view of himself as a modern-day Caesar. The style was elegant, grand, and a little severe, but Josephine's true passion was for the gardens. She wanted to create a garden that contained every type of plant that could be grown in France. She hired botanists and gardeners. She used Napoleon's military and diplomatic network to acquire rare plants and seeds from all over the world. Ships were ordered not to attack vessels that were carrying plants for her. She had a particular love for roses. She set out to collect every known variety of rose. She gathered over 250 different types in the gardens at Malmaison. It was the largest collection of roses in the world. To document this collection, she hired the greatest botanical illustrator of the day, Pierre-Joseph Redoute. Between 1817 and 1824, he produced a series of stunningly beautiful and scientifically accurate watercolor paintings of her roses. They were published in a magnificent book, Les Roses. It remains one of the greatest works of botanical art ever created. Malmaison was not just about plants, it was also a zoo. Josephine collected exotic animals. She had kangaroos, emus, and black swans from Australia. She had llamas, gazelles, and monkeys. She even had an orangutan that she dressed in clothes and let eat at the table. This was partly scientific curiosity, but it was also a way of displaying the global reach of Napoleon's empire. Josephine was also a major patron of the arts and fashion. She was a trendsetter. Her elegant, high-waisted dresses in the neoclassical style were copied all over Europe. She was a major client of the finest Parisian jewelers, furniture makers, and porcelain factories. Malmaison was filled with the best examples of the empire style. Her marriage to Napoleon was passionate but stormy. He loved her, but she was unable to give him an heir. In 1810, for political reasons, he divorced her. It was a heartbreaking event for both of them. Josephine retired to Malmaison, which Napoleon allowed her to keep. She continued to expand her gardens and her collections. She died at Malmaison in 1814, shortly after Napoleon's first abdication. Her legacy is a style. The Empire style, with its clean lines and classical motifs, owes much to her taste. And her garden at Malmaison was a landmark in the history of horticulture. It was a living museum, a scientific laboratory, and a work of art. Through her love of roses and her passion for collecting, Josephine created a small paradise that captured the spirit of an age. Number 2, did a queen's grief build a museum? She sponsored the Great Exhibition of 1851, a spectacular showcase of industrial technology and design from around the world. She embraced the new art of photography, both as a patron and an amateur practitioner. After her husband's death, she retreated from public life, but she oversaw the creation of a vast cultural complex in his memory, including the Royal Albert Hall and what would become the Victoria and Albert Museum. She was Queen Victoria, and her long reign defined an era not just of empire and industry, but of art and innovation. Victoria became queen in 1837 at the age of 18. Her marriage to her cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, was a deep and loving partnership. Albert was not just her husband. He was her closest advisor, and a man of great intelligence and progressive ideas. Much of the artistic and scientific patronage of Victoria's reign was a joint enterprise, driven by Albert's vision and supported by the Queen's authority. Their greatest project was the Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry of All Nations, held in 1851. It was Albert's brainchild. The idea was to bring together manufactured goods, raw materials, and works of art from across the globe to celebrate human ingenuity and promote free trade. A revolutionary building was designed to house it, the Crystal Palace. It was a massive structure of cast iron and glass, a marvel of modern engineering. The exhibition was a phenomenal success. Over 6 million people visited it. It showcased everything from the Koh-i-Noor diamond to the first Flushing public toilets. It was a celebration of the industrial age and Britain's leading role in it. The profits from the exhibition were used to purchase land in South Kensington and London. Albert's plan was to create a permanent center for the arts and sciences there. He called it Albertopolis. Victoria and Albert were also early adopters of photography. They were fascinated by the new medium. They began collecting photographs in the 1840s. They commissioned photographers to document the royal family and public events. They became the first royal patrons of the Photographic Society of London. They also took and developed their own photographs, setting up a darkroom at Windsor Castle. Their vast collection provides an intimate and modern-seeming record of their lives. In 1861, Prince Albert died suddenly of typhoid fever. Victoria was devastated. She entered a state of deep mourning and withdrew from public life for many years. Her grief was profound, but it also became a powerful creative force. She was determined to create a fitting memorial to her husband and to complete the cultural projects he had started. The first part was a personal monument, the Albert Memorial in Kensington Gardens. It is a huge, ornate, Gothic-style monument with a gilded statue of Albert sitting under a canopy. It is covered in sculptures representing the continents, the arts, and the sciences. It is the ultimate expression of high Victorian taste. The more significant part of her memorial was the completion of Albertopolis. She oversaw the construction of the Royal Albert Hall, a massive concert and assembly hall. And she supported the development of the museums that were founded on the South Kensington site. The most important of these was the South Kensington Museum, which had been established to house objects from the Great Exhibition and to serve as a museum of applied art and design. Its goal was to educate British designers and workers, and to improve the quality of British manufactured goods. In 1899, in one of her last public appearances, Queen Victoria laid the foundation stone for a new building for the museum and announced that it would be renamed the Victoria and Albert Museum. During her long reign, Victoria's personal tastes shaped the art of the era. She was a keen amateur artist herself, and she and Albert were patrons of painters like Sir Edwin Landseer, famous for his paintings of animals, and Franz Xaver Winterhalter, the great royal portraitist. The Victorian era was a time of immense change of empire, industry, and invention. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert were not just passive figures presiding over it. Through projects like the Great Exhibition and the creation of the South Kensington Museums, they actively tried to shape it. They believed in the power of art, science, and education to improve society. The V&A Museum, a vast treasure house of decorative arts from around the world, is the most powerful legacy of a queen who turned her personal grief into a lasting public gift. Number 1. Can you rebuild a paradise after it's been burned to the ground? Foreign armies invaded her capital and burned her favorite palace to the ground. She was a concubine who rose to become the de facto ruler of China for nearly 50 years. She was accused of being a reactionary despot who brought about the end of her dynasty. But she was also a major patron of the arts who oversaw the rebuilding of one of the world's most magnificent gardens and became an early and enthusiastic subject of photography. She was the Empress Dowager Cixi. Cixi was born in 1835 to a relatively minor Manchu family. At 16, she was selected to be a concubine for the Xianfeng Emperor. In 1856, she gave birth to his only son. This elevated her status immensely. When the emperor died in 1861, her 5-year-old son became the Tongzhi Emperor. Cixi, along with the emperor's official wife, became co-regents. From this position, through shrewd political maneuvering, she would be the supreme power in China until her death in 1908. Her rule coincided with a period of immense turmoil for China. The country was racked by internal rebellions and increasing pressure from Western powers. In 1860, during the Second Opium War, British and French forces marched on Beijing. They looted and then completely destroyed the old summer palace, the Yuanming Yuan, a vast complex of palaces, gardens, and art collections. This was a national humiliation. One of Cixi's great projects was the restoration of a different imperial garden complex nearby, the Garden of Clear Ripples. It too had been damaged by the foreign troops. Cixi decided to rebuild it on an even grander scale and rename it the Summer Palace, the Yihai Yuan. This became her passion project and her primary residence. The project was hugely expensive. Cixi was accused of diverting funds intended for the modernization of the Chinese Navy to pay for the palace. Most famously, she used the money to build a magnificent two-story marble boat, a stone structure built at the edge of the lake that served as a tea house. Her critics saw this as the ultimate symbol of her extravagance and folly. She built a boat that could not sail while her nation's navy rotted. But the Summer Palace she created is a masterpiece of Chinese landscape design. It covers over 700 acres, dominated by Longevity Hill and the man-made Kunming Lake. It contains a vast array of palaces, temples, bridges, and pavilions. The long corridor is a covered walkway over 700 meters long, decorated with more than 14,000 paintings. The entire complex was designed to be a perfect, idealized landscape, a retreat from the world. For Cixi, rebuilding it was an act of defiance, a way of restoring a piece of Chinese glory after the humiliation of 1860. Cixi was also a great patron of traditional Chinese arts. She was a skilled painter and calligrapher herself. She loved Beijing opera and had a large theater built at the Summer Palace. She would spend entire days watching performances. Her patronage helped to elevate the status of opera and its star performers. Perhaps most surprisingly, this seemingly traditional empress was fascinated by new technology. She was an early and enthusiastic patron of photography. In 1903, she allowed a young photographer named Yu Shunling to take a series of portraits of her and her court. This was unprecedented. Before this, the emperor's face was considered sacred and could not be depicted realistically. The Cixi took an active role in the photo shoots. She chose the locations, the costumes, and the poses. She had herself photographed in elaborate gowns, sometimes dressed as the Buddhist goddess of mercy, Guanyin. These photographs were a form of public relations. She had them sent to foreign leaders, including President Theodore Roosevelt. They were an attempt to control her own image on the world stage, to present herself not as a cruel tyrant, but as a dignified and cultured ruler. Cixi's legacy is complex and controversial. For many, she is the villain of modern Chinese history, the conservative whose resistance to reform doomed the Qing dynasty. But she was also a woman of great taste and will. The Summer Palace is a testament to her vision. Her photographs give us a rare, personal glimpse of a woman who held immense power in a world that was changing around her. In rebuilding her garden paradise and crafting her own image, she was trying to hold on to a world of beauty and order, even as her empire was crumbling.